Good morning, guys. My name is Brian. I am a science teacher. I teach biology and chemistry. I'm also a recovering addict of 20 plus years on and off of benzos and opioids. I am currently tapering off of methadone, which is a substance that we're going to talk about today in the context of this month's book pick, because it was actually invented by the Nazis when they realized that their supply of opium was likely to be limited or cut off entirely during World War II. So they had so many rank and file members as well as leadership who were addicted to opium or morphine or heroin, and they had to come up with a solution. And methadone was actually the solution. So right away, we're starting to tie in here. But yeah, so I am a teacher, former medical student. I run an addiction and recovery blog called the Concrete Confessional Blog, and I'm just a little bit scatterbrained these days because of insomnia from my methadone taper. But everyone has been incredibly kind and supportive. I can't tell you guys how much it means. Like it actually objectively makes a difference to how positively I think about what I'm doing and to how my own estimation of my chances at success. So thank you all for the kind messages. It is such a beautiful thing to wake up to in the morning, and such a wonderful thing to be able to check throughout the night when I'm having night like last night where I don't hardly sleep at all. So yeah, so this is our first installment of Druggie Book Club. This month's pick is by German journalist Norman Ohler. It's called Blitzed, Drugs in the Third Reich. Now, next month's pick is going to be Kat Marinel's autobiography, How to Murder Your Life. After that, I'm hoping we can do a community poll to see what everybody wants to read for the third month, and then we can read in advance so that we can, I'll make a video with my own sort of notes and responses for whatever we pick, but then also we can do a live stream or maybe a Discord chat so that we can all like process it together. So yeah, this is a new thing I'm trying called our monthly Druggie book club, and today it's Norman Ohler's Blitzed. Super excited about talking about this. By the way, I have so many notes. Usually when I'm doing YouTube videos, I'll just have like 4 or 5 very brief bullet point style notes, but I took such detailed notes because there's just so much. And this is a book that is sort of self-contained in the sense that it just explains the history of psychoactive substance use during the Third Reich. However, when I was reading this, I could not stop drawing the parallels between then and now. Like history really is just a flat circle. Time is a flat circle in some ways. And so in my own analysis of this book, that's how I'm approaching it. I actually picked out 4 key patterns that were, in terms of our struggles with these substances in the modern day that were prefigured during Nazi Germany and to some extent the Weimar Republic, which came directly before the Third Reich. So it is fascinating stuff, like I said, like truly fascinating stuff that I'm really excited to pick apart. And it's interesting because right now we're at kind of a historical endpoint, right? I mean, the war on drugs has failed. We have spent decades of trying to sort of like from the top down smash the supply of drugs, and it has done nothing but drive all the actors involved to ever more desperate criminal behavior. It has been one of the most, if not the most abject global policy failure in the history of civilization, in my opinion. It's unbelievable how much not only have we suffered as addicts in first world countries, but oh my gosh, the people who feed our appetites for these things, it's unbelievable how much like political unrest, how much like really like economic slavery and exploitation has been involved in the chain of production for these substances that we're taking. So it's been a failure across the board. And in terms of the impact in the US, since 1999, we have had over 1 million Americans die from drug overdoses. Again, since 1999, directly from overdoses, not including all the other sequelae of addiction that kill even more people. Okay, 1 million. So I did some figuring for my blog. I thought this is a war, right? It's a war of our government against its own citizens, which is repugnant, but it is a war. So I said, let's compare the casualties of the war on drugs, those 1 million overdoses, to the casualties in in terms of our troops serving in various wars. And I added it all up, and sure enough, we have lost more casualties to the war on drugs than all of the soldiers who have died in all of the wars since the end of the Revolutionary War. So if that doesn't like take your breath away, I don't know what will. The other thing is, the deaths, of course, are not the only, they're sort of the most um, irreversible, shocking, like blatantly awful consequence of the war on drugs, but they are certainly not, the biggest in terms of numbers, or the sort of like the only major consequence of this failed war on drugs. So we in the United States, the land of the free, right? We incarcerate more people today per capita. So we're not just incarcerating more because we're a bigger country. This is taking into account that we're a big country. So per head, we incarcerate more people in the United States today than any other country on earth, save for perhaps North Korea, for which we don't have adequate data. So we are at this endpoint. The war on drugs has failed, and it's so easy to take with the system we're born into for granted. So like it seems such an obvious paradigm in some ways that these controlled substances have to be regulated. Either they're made completely illegal or they're only able to be accessed through the medical system. But like we forget that before the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, which I think was 1914, there was essentially no regulation of these things. That was the first piece of legislation in America, at least, that required registration for doctors and pharmacists and other people who are selling these addictive substances, and that required them to pay tax on it. After that, we had our legislation that created different categories of controlled substances, including ones that had no medical uses, which we call Schedule 1 now, as well as the categories, so say Schedule 2 through Schedule 5, I believe, that have medical uses but are strictly controlled to whatever level because they have addictive potential and the potential to be abused for fun, basically. So again, if you went back 100 years, 110 years, you could go down to the corner store, you could get a tincture of opium and alcohol, you could get heroin, you could get morphine, you could get cannabis and cocaine, you could get all of those in one formulation, I kid you not. And it seems a little bit crazy to think you could just go down to your corner store and get those relatively weak preparations, or if you needed something stronger, go to your doctor and get, say, an ounce of morphine. That was no problem. Addiction was viewed as an anticipated side effect that could be managed just like any other side effect. It wasn't a reason to stop taking the drug necessarily. It was just something to to manage, So that was how things were, and it was exponentially better. I mean, again, this is a failure. There is no possible analysis in which the war on drugs is anything except an abject failure. And what's really interesting, again, is how much of our current struggles with these addictive substances, especially the opioids, the amphetamines, and a couple of other classes of substances, was prefigured in what happened in the Weimar Republic and in Nazi Germany. So that's the lens through which I read this book, and through which I'm analyzing it in this little talk that I'm giving today, okay? So again, we're talking about the Weimar Republic, so the years in Germany after World War I, and then Nazi Germany, so the Third Reich itself. So it's really interesting that a lot of these addictive drugs were playing such a big role by this point in history, because a lot of them were only produced regularly at scale and with reasonable sort of purity and consistency of dose during the early 20th century. So for example, the synthesis of morphine, heroin, methamphetamine, many other mind-altering chemicals wasn't accomplished for the first time until well into the 1800s. Believe it or not, like injection as a route of administration wasn't really possible with any frequency, safety, or cleanliness until 1850, until halfway through the 1800s. So boom, these chemicals, these really potent, especially the synthetic chemicals that we're going to be talking about, like methamphetamine and heroin's semi-synthetic, but they come onto the scene, in the mid to late 1800s, and then by the early to mid 1900s, they are totally driving this epic conflict between Nazi Germany and the other Axis powers and the Allies in the West. So this stuff blew up in a hurry, is what I'm getting at there. And we went from synthesizing these chemicals in the lab for the first time ever to mass producing them and consuming them to the extent that they played a fundamental, maybe even a decisive role in world history during the Second World War from 1939 to 1945. So it's interesting, we had this sort of exponential growth in drug use, and in drug use impacting society and history. So I want to start by setting the historical stage a little bit, okay? So this is post-World War I Germany, and Germany is a nation that is just, it's a proud nation. I call the Germans the Chinese of Europe, okay? And a lot of confidence and pride in themselves as a nation all throughout history. And after World War I, Germany is a nation that's heartbroken, humiliated, period. So in addition to assigning catastrophic reparations, as well as restricting the German military, the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I inflicted a wound on German national pride. Like, it's impossible to exaggerate how much of a humiliation this was. The average German person felt it in their bones. I mean, they were just totally dejected. It was like a whole country couldn't walk around with their heads raised high because of how humiliated they were, okay? So in retrospect, we know that after a war, we know in post-conflict anthropology now, you cannot leave a country in that state. It will inevitably lead to more war, and it often leads directly to a fascist regime, because like only a sort of rabidly jingoistic regime would assuage the the hurt of that that pride injury. So we know not to leave countries like that in that state. But back then, we were still learning. So as Germany floundered economically during its fledgling democratic years, the Weimar Republic became the center of this really decadent culture. It was a party culture of sexual freedom where cabaret, drag, and transsexualism flourished. There was a ton of drug taking, including heroin, morphine, and cocaine. These were particularly popular and largely unregulated for the first part of the 20th century. There was this nihilistic, round-the-clock hedonism that was best summarized by a slogan of the time that said, "Berlin, take a breath. Bear in mind your dance partner is death." To give you an idea of just how far along things had gotten in terms of substance abuse during the Weimar Republic years, it was estimated that during those years, 40% of Berlin doctors were addicted to morphine. So that is shocking by any standard for any time period. 40% of doctors in Berlin are addicted to morphine during the Weimar Republic years. Forget about cocaine, heroin, and all the other options, right? What's really interesting, again, you see these patterns established during the Third Reich and the Weimar Republic years that continue in the present day. And it's intriguing that the Nazis were the first sort of government to make it illegal for addicted doctors to practice. So doctors who were addicted were barred from medicine for 5 years, which is really interesting because to this day in the US and a lot of other Western countries, if you are exposed as an addict as a physician, there is a really intense period of monitoring and licensing restriction that lasts, guess how long? 5 years. I'm telling you guys, all these matchups between then and now it was fascinating to read this book for that reason. So these Germans knew that this hedonism was not like coming from a good place. They knew that it was ultimately self-destructive, and Hitler capitalized upon that knowledge and that self-insight to leverage political power. So as the National Socialists defeated the Communists and gained power during the 1920s and 1930s, Hitler was very careful to develop his image as a teetotaler. He was this abstemious vegetarian who wouldn't drink or take drugs. He wouldn't even indulge in sexual relationships for fear of them distracting from his mission to restore the fatherland. So on a lot of levels, not really a very exciting guy, not a guy very in touch with the good things in life on a certain level. So Hitler fomented what Ohler, who wrote this book again, characterizes as an ideological intoxication. I love that phrase, ideological intoxication. So Hitler wanted the German people so brimming with political frenzy that they gave themselves over to quote unquote collective ecstasy. Hence the constant parades, the violently nationalistic films and songs, the othering of everyone other than Aryan Germans, and these endless shrill speeches that in retrospect, they look totally ridiculous. You see a video of Hitler screaming almost like a little girl, and it's like, how did this man result in the deaths of 6 million plus Jews, gypsies, homosexuals? Like, it is just mind-blowing. It looks so silly from the modern lens, and it's just the perfect storm of him appealing to that wounded German national pride othering the right people and riding this awful crest of energetic hate, to the ultimate destruction of his own country and a lot of the Western world. Okay, so as Hitler consolidated his power, he formalized and legislated his anti-drug stance, and that had several key components. So again, I'm discussing this in terms of patterns between what happened during the Nazi years and what is still going on today. Okay, so during the Third Reich, we had one of history's first modern wars on drugs. Literally, it was, I think it's called a Rauschgiftbekämpfung. I assume Kampf is the same like Mein Kampf, struggle or fight or something like that. Okay, so this was one of modern history's first wars on drugs. So, of course, there hasn't really, no government has ever really engaged in a true war on drugs. They've all been better described as wars on the people who use certain substances. So, as in any such political maneuver, drugs were recategorized as acceptable or unacceptable. Again, it is never a war on all drugs, it's a war on certain drugs. So in Nazi Germany, the use of cocaine, morphine, and heroin, which had flourished during the Weimar Republic years when German pharmaceutical giants had become world leaders in their production, was now severely curtailed. Quick side note. Okay, so Merck, which was one of these huge German pharmaceutical companies, it had been making high purity cocaine that was put into bricks with a certain stamp on them. And this cocaine was so desirable that Ohler says you could take that, say you were a diplomat, you'd take that on whatever private flight you were on, and anywhere in the world, Merck cocaine was as good or better than cash. Like it was that desired. So you got these German, the first big pharma companies during the Weimar Republic years are flooding the market with high quality cocaine, morphine, and heroin. Now, Hitler shuts this down. He is someone who has this image of being, an abstainer himself, and he tells everyone like, we got to turn this around. This is destroying our society. We're rotting from the inside out. But he says this isn't our own weakness, because that would require us admitting fault. This is us being set up. So Hitler and the Nazi propagandists went to great deliberate pains to connect the consumption of addictive drugs with undesirable groups like Jews, homosexuals, and criminals. So Hitler wanted the German people to believe that they were being poisoned by subversive groups that sought to hobble the country indefinitely. What we would now, in the modern day, call narco-terrorism, which is a phrase that I only heard once, but I think it's a perfect term for what that is trying to describe. So if you happen to have picked up a habit, you face cold turkey withdrawal and a 2-year involuntary detainment that could be extended indefinitely. To this day, we have civil commitments for different circumstances in which mental health is judged to be compromised. So in the U.S., there are huge constitutional concerns about this. But if you were judged to be an addict in Nazi Germany, again, could be picked up off the street and you could be committed for 2 years of involuntary detainment. Now, of course, whether this happened to you wasn't fair or random. It was largely dependent on if you were racially pure or not. In fact, the German registration form for drug users literally had check marks for which racial or ethnic categories each person fulfilled. So I'm going to show a picture of that if I can drop it into the video file. Also, intersectionality definitely prevailed in this setup. So if you happen to be homosexual or transsexual or transgender and a drug user, your chances of being detained dramatically increased. Your chances of being detained for longer increased. And as I'm going to talk about in a second, there were some other really scary things that could happen to you. So this is the ID card for the Reich Central Office for Combating Drug Transgressions, which identified you as a dealer, a prescription forger, a Eucadol, that was oxycodone addict, or whatever other variety of problem child you happen to be. So interestingly, the Führer, so Hitler himself became a Eucadol addict, which we'll talk about a little bit later, in those paranoid bunker years toward the end of the Third Reich, and I'm pretty sure he didn't have to carry one of these cards around, guys. So you were also given a color-coded identity based on whether you were Jewish, German, Aryan, or whatever other racial or ethnic group that you belonged to, like I said. So the other thing is the Nazis convinced the German people that it was their responsibility to report on family members and neighbors who used drugs. They created this really big sort of secretive anti-drug information network, which foreshadowed our modern police approach with informants, with undercover agents acting in drug distribution networks. Also, like DARE. DARE was actually, if you look into the history of the US anti-drug program called DARE, Drug Abuse Resistance Education, it was partly a workaround because the courts had ruled you can't have undercover agents in schools investigating drug distribution until you know for sure that there is a crime happening there. So they created this informational program through which police officers could get into school, teach the kids about drugs. And sure enough, if you look back at the early DARE program years, you see that kids came in, they had just learned what drugs looked like. They reported on their parents and the parents were arrested. So again, these parallels are shocking when you consider the passage of time and how different sort of at its face value our society is from Nazi Germany now. So again, if you were, if you checked more than one box as far as what was considered problematic identity or problematic behavior, you were much more likely than, say, a German Aryan with a drug problem to be detained and have awful things happen to you. So, for example, if you were an addicted Jew or homosexual or transsexual, you were subject to compulsory sterilization. So they could actually take your ability to reproduce away from you. You could also meet the definition for criminal insanity, in which case euthanasia was a possibility as well. They could kill you. So all of the above, transsexualism or transgenderism, homosexuality, partying, was excused if you were a high-ranking Nazi. Of course, that was different, obviously. So the other big pattern here was that the Nazis were the first group to develop an opioid maintenance drug. So as I mentioned before, there were kind of a lot of Nazis and quote-unquote racially pure Aryan Germans who found themselves dependent upon opium, morphine, or heroin and unable to quit. So one of the most high-ranking German officials who was in this category was what's his name? Hermann Göring, who was actually the leader of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, and very close to Hitler. He was this very kind of weird, flamboyant guy. He would wear these almost like lordly outfits of satin and old materials. People laughed at him behind his back. He would shoot up morphine and he would get this very, almost like a mania, and he would make terrible strategic decisions. And actually his nickname behind his back was Moring, because morphine sounds like that in German. So that's one example. Göring was an example of a really high-ranking Nazi official who was dependent on opioids. And Hitler knew that these people couldn't just go cold turkey, and he knew that opium supply was going to be cut off by all the conflicts that were raged, North Africa, Europe, all the way to Russia as part of World War II, as part of the Blitzkrieg, the German Lightning War. So they had to find an alternative. So Nazi Germany's solution, given that their plans for, and Morin committed suicide, by the way, but Nazi Germany's solution, given that their plans for global military conquest meant that opium supply would be sporadic at best, was to synthesize methadone, a highly potent, long-acting opioid that didn't require poppies as raw materials. So there's a really cool bit of lore here, which if you've been on methadone, you've probably heard this somewhere. So one of the drug's original trade names, so the original trade name for methadone was Dolafine. So legend had it that the Dol in the drug's name was a nod to Adolf Hitler. But that's not true. So it actually came from the Latin word dolor, which means pain, with the "fine" suffix used not just as a common ending for alkaloids, which are chemicals that come from plants, but also in the phonetic sense of "fin," F-I-N, meaning end. So dolafine literally meant pain end. So, our standard treatment for opioid addiction today is maintenance with buprenorphine, also known as Suboxone, or a bunch of other trade names, or methadone. So again, this started in Nazi Germany, and it's still our best treatment today. It's the parallels. I know I keep saying, and I don't want to overdo it, but it is just shocking how much of what we're going through today traces back to this period in some form. All right, so pattern 3 is this is perhaps, meaning within the Nazi party and within Nazi Germany more widely, this was perhaps the first populist movement that explicitly advocated vitamins and natural remedies. So Hitler's physician was this GP quack named Dr. Morell. He was this German society doctor who was renowned for treating ailments that didn't exist with hopefully harmless vitamin and supplement injections. So Dr. Morell promised to Führer that his persistent GI problems caused by, being a raving lunatic with an imbalanced diet who obsessed about Jews and homosexuals and restoring the fatherland could be relieved using daily injections of vitamins, glucose, and, of all things, glandular extracts from various animals. I don't understand that. Hitler was such a fervent vegetarian, but he was actually taking whole gland extracts by injection. But anyway, Dr. Morell met Adolf Hitler, another fun fact, at a dinner party that was given to thank Dr. Morell for treating the Nazi propagandist Heinrich Hoffmann's kidney infection. That kidney infection, by the way, came from gonorrhea, which is an STD. So it must have been all that clean living that the Nazis espoused that resulted in the gonorrhea, right? So, of course, when stress was amplified during the final years of the Nazi regime and Hitler needed a boost, Dr. Morell felt that the animal extracts the glandular extracts were just not cutting it anymore. So he ended up giving Hitler Eucadol, oxy, which Hitler became grievously addicted to. Hitler was also given cocaine by a different physician. Now, Ohler does a prime journalistic job. He literally goes through all of Morell's day-to-day records of what injections he gave Hitler for years on end. And Ohler notes that Dr. Morell was shielding Hitler. Even, in the final days, he was lying about what he was giving him. You could see that he was intentionally covering up how much Eucadol Hitler was taking. And Ohler did a phenomenal investigative journalism job on that count. So I highly recommend picking up this book. I got it on a Friday, and I didn't stop reading it until Saturday night. Or I literally didn't sleep until I had finished it. So I won't get into all the details because I want you guys to buy and read the book. But yeah, so Hitler was using Eucadol fairly heavily, particularly during the bunker years. And as the Third Reich fell apart, he was also using cocaine. And he had a really strange, these authoritarian leaders are bizarre. When they start doing things that they know they could become addicted to. I was reading this piece about one of the Kim leaders in North Korea who, he was, I think it was Kim Jong-il, and he was given a painkiller after I think he was thrown off a horse or something. And his doctor told him, maybe you could become addicted to this. And so this Kim leader made his two closest advisors and confidants also take the injections so that if he got addicted, they did too, which I think is again, these authoritarian leaders and their philosophies around, things that could hurt them and spreading the pain around. It just blows my mind. But anyway, I'm getting off track. So during the final days of Nazi Germany, again, Hitler would go into cold turkey withdrawal because there were no opioid pharmaceuticals left. The supplies had been completely cut off toward the end of the war, and the German pharmaceutical factories had been bombed out and shut down. So Hitler did not react well to this. He accused Dr. Morell of giving him the what he called the morphine, but it was actually Eucadol, oxy, from the very beginning. He thought that maybe Dr. Morell was poisoning him, or that he had been giving him the Eucadol again from the very beginning against Hitler's wishes and without his knowledge. So it got really, really dark during the final months or year and a half of the Third Reich as everything was collapsing and Hitler was in cold turkey withdrawal. I mean, I can't imagine that. So it wasn't just Hitler, was back to the vitamins and supplements. I'm all over, I know, but bear with me. So it wasn't just Hitler who was into vitamins and supplements. So the Nazis, it was part of their philosophy. They emphasized that the German people's bodies belonged to their country and its future, and that they needed to maintain them in peak form because of that. So instead of drinking and taking drugs, a variety of vitamins and supplements were shilled. Think Alex Jones and InfoWars, but state-backed and fully Nazi. So Dr. Morell was a shrewd businessman. He convinced Hitler to allow him to take over businesses that had been confiscated from Jewish owners in occupied areas, and to use them to manufacture his supplements, most of which were bogus and some of which were dangerous. So various German military divisions actually ordered their troops to take these vitamins and supplements too. One more quick note, in addition to his abuse of oxy, cocaine, and possibly methamphetamine, it has been suggested that Hitler's dramatic Parkinson's-like deterioration during his final 2 years was caused in part by an autoimmune response that was triggered by this several daily injections of animal extracts that Dr. Morell prescribed. So your body sees these foreign materials that are incredibly similar to your own proteins, but not identical to your own proteins. And that tends to generate a hell of an immune response. And there are specific antibodies manufactured against certain glandular extracts that Dr. Morell was known to prescribe and give to Hitler intravenously, which can attack the immune system. So there's a theory that Hitler had such a mental deterioration because of a Parkinson's-like disease process that was caused by all of these glandular extract injections. So, of course, vitamins and supplements only get you so far on the path to global dominance. The Nazis relied on methamphetamine more so than vitamins and minerals, which I'll discuss next. So, the fourth pattern is that during Nazi Germany, we had history's first amphetamine craze. So as I mentioned above, during the Weimar Republic years, the German pharmaceutical giants such as Merck and IG Farben led the world in synthetic drug creation, testing, and mass production. One chemical that really fascinated the Nazis, that piqued their interest from the beginning, was methylamphetamine, also known as we call it in the US today, methamphetamine, which had been synthesized by the Japanese at the end of the 1800s. This drug so appealed to the Third Reich because it promised to increase focus, stamina, and productivity as the war effort ground on and food was increasingly scarce. It also allowed people to function without their normal caloric intake. So from the beginning, the Third Reich thought that methamphetamine had a lot of potential. So when American athletes blew the world away in the 1936 Olympics, thanks partly to their use of the amphetamine benzedrine, German scientists dove headlong into methamphetamine production and popularization. So there's this pill called Pervitin, which was methamphetamine tablets, as well as methamphetamine chocolates called Hildebrand chocolates. They were embraced by students, housewives, factory workers, long-haul truckers, doctors and other medical workers, and military personnel, which, by the way, those are the exact same groups which heavily use Adderall and other synthetic stimulants today. So here's an advertisement for Hildebrand chocolates. The inscription, or the slogan, I guess, the little marketing phrase, it says, "Hildebrand chocolates always delight." Wasn't surprising given that they contained a whopping 14 milligrams of methamphetamine per serving. That was compared to 3 milligrams per Pervitin pill. 14 milligrams is a huge dose. To this day, methamphetamine is Schedule 2 in the US, meaning you can get a prescription for it. It's not totally without medical use, okay? So it's not Schedule 1. If you get prescribed, I forget the name, Desoxin maybe? No, maybe that's Dexedrine, I'm not sure. But if you get prescribed methamphetamine in the US today, I believe the starting dose is 4 or 5 milligrams. And they tend to keep you at that dose without going up too much. So 14 milligrams, huge dose in these Hildebrand chocolates. Of course, they're delighting. Okay, so this was one of the world's first big pharma-led social engineering coups. So there was this extensive, catchy advertising campaign. There were free samples of these methamphetamine formulations for physicians. There were even biased clinical trials that concealed evidence of harmful side effects and addiction. So again, this is the rise of Big Pharma. These are the same issues we see that led to the oxy epidemic, that disguised the vast overprescription of benzos, which are really destructive drugs that I made another video about, whose side effects, whose dependence potential, whose long-term damage effects have been totally concealed because Big Pharma is sponsoring the studies, and the people who are selling these drugs obviously don't want the full negative effects known. So yeah, this was the first example in history of one of these Big Pharma-led social engineering coups. So methamphetamine was even coined the Volksdrug, which meant the people's drug, which would lead Nazi Germany to recapture the glory of the fatherland. It was like the gasoline for the Third Reich. To quote Ohler, Pervitin, again, methamphetamine tablets, allowed the individual to function in the dictatorship. It was National Socialism in pill form. It was equally essential to the German Blitzkrieg. Again, that was the lightning war across Europe, Africa, and Asia. By the time that the Nazis invaded Poland in 1939, many German military leaders were dosing their troops with Providin to help them stay awake and focused for unnaturally long periods, again, especially with less caloric consumption. So without that mass consumption of Providin, the surprise German invasion of France early on in the war, which involved a tank-led sickle cut maneuver considerably north of where the Allies anticipated that invasion would occur, would never have succeeded. So German forces went without sleep for over 3 days to accomplish that offensive. And that euphoria, that blood loss, that fearlessness that was induced by the methamphetamine amplified morale to an incredible degree. What was really interesting too was it led to this bizarre strategy. So traditionally, like in all of military strategy up to that point, they push into France, they use the sickle cut maneuver, and the Nazis break through with incredible force with very few casualties. This is a huge military victory. Traditionally, you would consolidate that. You would leave troops behind to protect the area that you've seized. Like, you would do that. And because they were literally so hopped up on amphetamines, they just went full speed ahead. They didn't worry about protecting the land that they had conquered. They literally kept punching through, and that was so unexpected that the Allies just had no idea what to make of it. They couldn't get their head around the strategy, and because of that, the Nazis kept their advantage. They kept the Allies reacting. They kept the Allies on the defensive. They kept the Allies confused. So this was methamphetamine. This was down to speed use, that they were able to do this, and that they chose this bizarre, totally unexpected military strategy that was successful at first. However, German military leaders quickly learned that although most of the drug's benefits were illusory, it really didn't help, except with things like appetite suppression, it really didn't help as much as it seemed to for the first few, days or weeks of dosing their troops with it. They learned, however, that its very real after effects were debilitating, that dependence set in very quickly, and that continuing to push against physical and mental exhaustion inevitably led to collapse. So there's this guy named Leo Conti, who was the leader of the Reich Health Office. He campaigned against the epidemic of amphetamine addiction among the German military, noting that our young soldiers look extraordinarily ill, often gray and sunken-cheeked. So unfortunately, the problem was so deeply entrenched by this point that not even making Providin prescription only, which they did do, but that only applied to civilians, not soldiers, even then they couldn't correct it. Like, once you're dependent on something like methamphetamine, and if some of you guys have taken Adderall, you know this can happen to you even with low dose amphetamines today, right? Like, once you're used to studying with Adderall, you can't, in the short term, you can't just stop taking it. You'll be unfocused, you'll be tired, have no motivation, so you can get past that, by allowing your neuroplasticity to heal yourself, but it can take weeks and months that you don't have in the middle of a lightning war effort. So yeah, they did try to rein in the German soldiers' use of amphetamines and the German, the sort of rank and file citizens' use of amphetamine, but it just was too little too late. So not surprisingly, I guess, amphetamine, that erratic behavior and overconfidence has been implicated in a variety of poor strategic decisions that contributed to Nazi Germany losing the war. Not to mention some war crimes of unusual brutality. One thing that military historians often note is that where troops are taking amphetamines, oftentimes you see the most brutal sort of horror movie, surreally violent and bloodthirsty war crimes happen. So, to be fair, the Allies weren't exactly sober Samuels either. We gave our pilots goofballs, for example. That was amphetamine plus barbiturate formulations to quote-unquote enhance mission performance, which more accurately meant remove our fear-based self-preservation responses. But again, guys, it's obviously different when we do it. So those are these four main patterns that I picked up on in this book that arose during Nazi Germany and that are still relevant today. So I could just keep talking about this for literally another hour. Like, it is crazy how much the Third Reich's use of mind-altering chemicals shaped, predicted, illuminated our modern day relationships with these substances. It is totally fascinating stuff. Studying the story of these chemicals during the Third Reich is nothing short of studying the history of humanity itself. Again, I really hope that you all will consider reading this book, and I pride myself on having read a lot about the history of mind-altering substances. I don't just want to learn. I spent years studying, the chemical formulae of, various mind-altering drugs, of learning about the biochemistry and physiology of their action, of learning about tolerance, dependence, and withdrawal. But I pride myself on having also cared about the history and the sociology and even the spiritual implications of those drugs. And I can't tell you guys what a beautiful, intriguing, fresh take this Blitzed book presented. Again, it's focused on use of these chemicals during the Third Reich, but it has so much to say about everything that has come afterward. It's like a final thought. I was always taught that the horror of the Third Reich, and especially the Holocaust, lay in the sober mundanity, the sort of workaday bureaucratic approach to global military conquest and the extermination of entire groups of people. It's deeply sad, interesting, and cautionary to consider how an entire nation's use of addictive drugs by common people and political leaders alike created a collective state of intoxication within which Germans were able to delude themselves about the atrocities that they were committing. So again, the extent to which the Third Reich's experiences with these addictive chemicals presaged modern social and political patterns bears further consideration. In many ways, it was during the Third Reich that Western civilization achieved its modern relationship with addictive chemicals, with all the attendant fear, hypocrisy, and lack of moderation that this implies. All right, guys, so thank you so much. If you listened all the way to the end, thank you for staying with me. If you enjoyed this, please drop a comment below with your thoughts. Again, I'll be setting up a poll so that we can decide what we're going to read after Kat Marnell's How to Murder Your Life next month. And the reason I keep asking for likes and comments, and specifically comments in addition to the likes, is that YouTube does not push out content about drugs, even if it's not glorifying drugs, like through trip reports that focus on the positive effects. It's really tough to get this kind of content pushed out to a wider audience. It is not just about advertisers, it's also about YouTube's platform priorities. So it helps hugely when you guys leave comments. You are incredible about how engaged you have been with that whole process, and I really thank you for that. So again, I'm still dealing with, I feel myself tripping on my tongue. I know that I'm speaking a little bit quick sometimes, and at other times I'm blanking out a little bit, but I think I'm doing all right, and I'm so enjoying making this content and mostly hearing about what you all have to say about it. Thank you again for the support, and I will catch you next time.